So, let's go ahead and get started. We're at about time here. So welcome everyone to this week's seminar series, and the final one of the quarter, I believe, for School of Environmental and Forest Sciences, UW. For those of you who don't know me, though I think almost everybody here I know, I'm Brian Harvey, Assistant Professor in SEFS. And it is my honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Kathayoon Khalil, who is coming to us from the Oregon Zoo in Portland, Oregon, where she is the Conservation Impact Manager, which is a position that she just started a few weeks ago. And she's been on a whirlwind tour around both hemispheres of the planet since then. Prior to joining the zoo, she was the principal evaluator for the Seattle Aquarium, which is coincidentally where I thought she was working when I contacted her. Hey, you want to just come over and give a talk? Not realizing she was moving to Portland, so
like days later.
Still kind of local,
yeah.
But and was also the director of evaluation at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles County. Kathayoon also serves as adjunct professor in biology at Miami University of Ohio, where she teaches 2-week intensive field classes in biodiversity and conservation in some really cool places such as Brazil, which is where she was for the last 2 weeks before joining us here. She earned her PhD in Learning Sciences and Technology Design from Stanford University, her Master's in Environmental Studies at the Yale School of Forestry, which is the same program as many SEFS folks, including Kathayoon Khalil in the audience, have come through. And prior to that, Kathayoon earned her Bachelor's in Biology and Literature from Claremont McKenna College in Southern California. And prior to that, fun fact, she grew up in Portland and worked at the Portland Zoo.
Yeah, for like 13 years.
Yeah. And so Kathayoon's work centers on the evaluation of educational experiences in zoos and aquariums, including the development of empathy for animals and the inclusion of social sciences and conservation practices. And I'm super excited to hear her share a little bit about her research today on empathy for animals and how we develop empathy in service of conservation action. So please join me in a warm welcome to Dr. Kathayoon Khalil.
All right, hello. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. I applaud all of you for being here during finals, or like pre-finals week. So thank you for coming. It was really fun to come back into Seattle and take the link past my old house, and you know, it's all a little bit nostalgic, but it's really nice to be here even though I've only been gone for like 2 weeks. So today I'm going to talk to you a lot about a few things that I'm passionate about, and it'll all start with kind of a reframing of who I am and how I got to this place. And there's a lot of pictures from Brazil in here. So as Brian said, I'm Kathayoon Khalil. I'm recently the Conservation Impact Manager at the Oregon Zoo. And I started out in this field, as so many of us did, having formative experiences. I didn't know they were formative back then, but formative experiences in informal learning settings. So very little of what drove me to be the person I am today happened in a zoo, in a school. Most of it happened at the zoo, or at the museum, or at the science center, or in my backyard looking for fungus and mushrooms that my mom didn't want me touching. Those are the things that got me excited about the environment. And those are the things that kept me excited even as I went on to do my PhD, or was writing papers late at night, or taking tests that I didn't want to take on subjects I didn't want to learn, or even those I did want to learn. And so it got me thinking a lot about what it means to be an environmental scientist, what it means to care about the environment and to have a connection to wildlife and wild places. I have thought about this a lot as we come into this current stage of our social history, where in the very process of doing science is questioned, right? The value of science is questioned, let alone the social sciences. We were talking a little bit in our in this small group around lunch around the differentiation between hard and soft sciences, and what a detrimental and problematic differentiation that can be. So we've come to a place where we understand so little about what has connected us to the natural world that we come to question the study of that connection, or the things that we're surrounded by on a daily basis. So we're living in interesting times, and as many, if not all of you know, we're living in the midst of an extinction crisis. And so what that means is that our work has never been more challenging, but it's also never been more necessary. As a conservationist, I face an almost daily reminder that we're fighting what at times seems like a losing battle. But the really nice thing about working in a zoo is you also get to go out and see people interacting with wildlife on a daily basis. And that got me wondering a lot as a young researcher, what is that connection, right? What is really happening there when a kid goes to a zoo and watches an animal for more than 2 seconds? What happens when that animal responds to something that the kid does? What does that spark in their brain, and how does that create a tapestry of experiences that might lead them down a path, at least of environmental behavior, if not environmental lifestyle? This is a photo from our field site in Brazil where we have golden-lined tamarins. You can see her little radio collar on that, on that female. And it's one of those stories of a zoo how zoos can band together and save an entire species. So these are the kinds of things I wonder about and wrestle with. So when we're thinking about how to solve these complex problems that are taking all of our time and energy, it's becoming quickly very obvious that we're going to need creative solutions. A lot of this talk is going to weave in also some of the history of zoos and aquariums and how they moved from menageries to these fields of conservation and science research. And a big part of that is necessity, right? We came into a time when animals were being threatened all over the place, and zoos were the only places where people were going to see animals or pay attention to animals. And so these creative solutions started coming out because we needed them to. We needed to look at things in a new and different way. Environmental education was one of the main ways in which we engaged with the public. We called it environmental ed or conservation ed, and we're starting to actually move away from that term education. We're thinking about it more as engagement or inclusion, and less as this empty vessel approach to, let me tell you everything I know about the beach, right? Or let me tell you everything I know. It's not a starfish, it's a sea star, and if you get that wrong, you don't know science. But why are we doing any of this in the first place? And how can these understandings of human behavior guide our approaches to environmental education? A paper came out in 1990, which is like a billion years ago, that said that the ultimate aim of environmental education is behavior change. And that was somehow the most incendiary phrase to come out in any paper up to the time. Because people said, like, no, I don't care about, like, what, I just care about curiosity. I just want people to discover things. I just. But I land on the side that it's true. What we do care about, ultimately, is behavior change. Doesn't mean every single program has to change your behavior, but you should be able to create a logic chain that leads you to behavior for everything you do. Right, so if your program is meant to spark, say, empathy, which will be what I'll mostly be talking about, it's empathy in service of what? Right? Is it empathy in a vacuum? Or is it empathy so that we can treat animals better in our daily lives and in our non-daily lives? We can wrestle with this for a very long time, so I'll leave it for the Q&A if you want to talk more about whether behavior change is our ultimate goal or not. And it also brings up the question of what behaviors. This isn't to talk about environmental behavior change, but it could be, right? We could talk about how challenging it is to change people's behaviors. We will talk about it a little bit. And how we approach that complicated topic. For a very long time, we all operated under this idea that there's this like famous South African quote. It was like, the more I know, the more I'll care, the more I'll care, the more I'll do. You know that one? It's Baba Dion? No, like it's completely erroneous and wrong. It has been, I would scrub it from all of the walls of our institutions if I could, because it's not linear like that. It doesn't matter how much you know or what you feel. That has some bearing, but not an ultimate bearing on how you act. I'll return to that in a second. So there are a million approaches to changing behavior. One of the hardest things about behavior change is that it is dependent not only on the population, but on the issue, on the time period, on the socioeconomic context. So I'm just going to present one approach that we have taken to influencing conservation behavior change, one that we feel is particularly promising for a variety of reasons, and that's empathy. Empathy has become very trendy in our current thinking. Also this girl writes amazing comics, and I just highly recommend them. Sad Animal Facts, very funny. Empathy's become very trendy. Ever since the election, people are talking about why we do or don't empathize with other people. Right, we've been talking about the golden rule our whole lives, but what about the platinum rule? Treating other people as they would want to be treated, not as you would want to be treated. And so we thought about this, and we were actually approached by a funder, who shall remain anonymous, who said, as a zoo and Aquarium, we think you have a particularly strong grasp on empathy. So we would like you to study empathy in the context of these experiences. And we thought, ooh, that sounds like free money, because we do empathy all the time, so why wouldn't it be easy? What we didn't know is that empathy is so much more complicated than anything that it's been presented to us to be in the media, in the popular literature, and that's what makes it so exciting. So after a very, very lengthy literature review, we came up with this definition for empathy. So I'm going to let you read that for a second. And I want you to call out any words in here that are interesting to you. Any words that stand out. Yeah.
Stimulated?
Yeah, stimulated is a great one. Empathy does not happen in a vacuum. You do not just feel empathy for no reason at all. The feeling of empathy is stimulated by something that happens either to you or something that you perceive. What else? There's so many in here. Yeah.
Ability?
Aha, you picked my favorite one. So empathy, some people can be born more or less empathic. It is a characteristic that you can have. There are genes involved in your ability to feel empathy or not, or your characteristic of empathy, being an empath or not being an empath. But largely feeling empathy is an ability. If you are tall and born with fast twitch muscles, you may naturally be a fast runner, but if you never get off the couch, you're never gonna run a mile or win a marathon. You can be short and stocky and kind of naturally predisposed to being heavier, but if you go out there and run all the time, who knows, you could run a mile or whatever. Empathy is similar. You need to practice empathy in order to know how to feel it, right? You have to practice empathy in order to know how to drive it deeper and how to make it productive. This was very exciting for us to find because that means that zoos and aquariums can be empathy gyms. It means that science centers, nature centers, outdoor schools, college classrooms can be places where people can learn the ability to feel empathy and practice that in a safe space. So that when, just like another analogy, yoga, the whole idea of yoga is not to get into crazy poses. It's to learn to breathe so that when you're in complicated and hard situations, you're able to approach them with a greater level of peace. That's kind of like empathy. What are some other words that stand out? Yeah.
Relies.
Ooh, interesting. I have not thought about that one specifically, but it is predicated on this idea that it is an ability. That's very core to our understanding. Yeah. What about that spoke to you?
Well, just the idea that like you wouldn't be able to have it if you didn't have this.
Yes.
You wouldn't be able to have empathy if you didn't have this ability.
Great. That's great. There's actually some really interesting research about the antithesis of empathy, right? Like sociopathy and psychopathy, and how gene expression and just brain development can contribute to the lack of empathy or the inability to feel empathy. That's very interesting in a very different place than the one in which we're working, but also curious. What other words? Yeah.
I'm drawn to understand.
Yeah, so that trio of perceive, understand, and care. We'll unpack this a bit, but we often think of empathy just as being a feeling, right? Like I feel what you feel. That's what everyone says is empathy, right? But that's not necessarily true in the literature. Understanding can also be empathy in the right way, in the right modality. So if you're taking the perspective of someone and understanding how they feel, that's empathy also. That's a step beyond sympathy. There's one other word in here. Oh, there's a lot of them, but there's another word I'm really drawn to. It's funny giving this to a non-zoo context versus a zoo context. Yeah.
I'm going to go with animal.
Yeah. Empathy has been studied a lot, people to people. Our contribution to the literature, what makes what we're doing interesting, is that we are trying to understand how people feel empathy for animals. There's been some literature on animals feeling empathy for each other. We talk about this a little bit. It's kind of funny because we're very surprised and impressed whenever we find out that animals feel empathy, but it's like, yeah, duh. Like they feel empathy for others of their species. Like, why do we think we have the dominion over that? But what this very interesting interspecies empathy relationship, I feel like it intuitively makes sense to us. When you think about your pets, when you think about animals that you know very well, your ability to empathize with those animals is a no-brainer. And so this inclusion in the literature is not the first, but one of the newest ones to talk about this connection between empathy, or between animals and people in an empathic sense. All right, enough with the definition. So the reason we care, let's talk about conservation behavior again. The reason we care is because empathy has been demonstrated to be a promising predictor of your willingness to take conservation behavior. So they've done studies where they've told people two stories about the forest or the rainforest, one empathically framed, one non-empathically framed, and people's willingness to take action or donate or go out there or whatever is much higher, significantly higher in the framings that include an empathic packaging than in the ones that do not. That's pretty cool. We know of behavior that it is incredibly complicated. And the exercise I like to do is to think about the thing that you do on a daily basis that is the least environmentally friendly. So for me, that's eating hamburgers. I don't eat hamburgers every day, but I eat a lot of hamburgers. I know how much water and land. My dad's a climate scientist. I know all of the methane facts about cows. I care a lot about the environment. There's a lot of other fields I could be in and make a lot more money and probably work shorter hours, but I care about this, so I'm here. So why is it that I do something that I know to be wrong, it disaligns with my values, and yet I do it anyway? Right? And so now you can think about all the complexities of behavior, right? I don't want to go to a restaurant and be the only person who can't eat. I think hamburgers taste good. Sometimes when I go on a long run, I just need that protein, right? Or I think I do. Whatever the factors are, perceived or real, those are the influencers that matter, not how much you know or how much you care. And so empathy is one of the internal motivators that we think influences environmental behavior. That's very interesting as well, because when we think about behavior, you have internal and external motivators, right? At its very basic level, you decrease the barriers, increase the incentives. When you do that with externals, that's great for one-off behaviors. So if I want you to buy a Tesla, I'm going to drop the price of that Tesla. I'm going to give you lots of tax benefits because you have to do it one time. I don't care if you care about the environment. The Tesla, you're going to buy that once in 30 years. But if I want you to do something every day, like reduce your straw usage or reduce your use of any single-use plastic, I'm going to rely very heavily on internal motivators to drive that behavior. Can anyone think of the moment when the straw thing just flipped and took fire?
Picture of the tortoise with the straw.
Exactly. So there was a video that came out of a turtle with a straw up its nose, and they pulled the straw out of the turtle's nose, and it's like it's just this visceral, like, oh my God, what are we doing? It's not like anybody wasn't thinking about straws before that, but that was empathy. Right? That was a pivotal, visceral experience that we had where we understood what it would feel like, or we understood the experience or perspective of that animal and having a piece of plastic up its nose. And that flipped the entire conversation. So that's the example I give that's like, check, this matters, because that just changed everything about how we approach the straw problem. We made it less about waste in the ocean and more about individual animals that are affected by our decisions. So when we started to unpack this concept of empathy, I promised you that it got more complicated, and here's where it does. So empathy, as it turns out, is not just one thing. It's not just empathy, the umbrella term. It is three different components. There's cognitive empathy, behavioral empathy, and affective empathy. Nope. Cognitive empathy says that I understand what you're going through. You have a kid that drops their ice cream cone. You haven't dropped your ice cream cone in your life, maybe, but you understand that's like a fundamental bummer of the human existence, right? So you're like, I get it, I get what dropping your ice cream cone would feel like. That's cognitive empathy. Affective empathy is actually feeling what someone else is feeling. So that's like when you cry in a movie when the main character's crying. When you laugh when someone you love is laughing. And that's, well, no, I can't say that anymore. We used to think, up until like 2 weeks ago, that was dependent on mirror neurons. But a new study just came out, like right before I left the aquarium, that's actually not the case, and it's more complicated than just mirror neurons, so stay tuned on that. But then the last one is behavioral empathy, compassionate concern, or motivational empathy. And that is feeling empathy and having the desire to relieve the suffering of another based on that empathy. So you can think of a wide variety of examples of how that might be. People donate, all those like commercials of children like sad and like wandering through the desert, and you want to donate to save them. That's all like motivational empathy that they're capitalizing on. Now for us, that's not super productive because we don't want people to perceive the animals in our care as suffering, because they're not, right? We take great care of them. So we rely more on positive empathy, which is an emerging field. The lady who has done a lot of the work on it hasn't thought about it yet in terms of animals, but we're pushing her to, where you want to extend the joy and happiness of another. So we can imagine a myriad social structures in which that happens. I like to talk about bachelorette parties and bridal showers and weddings. Like, none of that has anything to do with you. But we participate in all of those because we want to extend the happiness of the people that we care about, the people close to us in our tribes or whatnot. And so positive empathy, we think, is a more productive place for us to work. Wherein you see our animals, we show you and demonstrate their good care. You understand that they have a high level of welfare, and you're motivated to help them. But then how do we draw that to negative empathy in the wild? How do we tell the stories of happy elephants at the zoo and then tell them about elephants who are being killed by palm oil plantation owners in Borneo, right? So that's a tension we don't have an answer to quite yet, but we're still trying to understand and wrestle with, because that's the big piece right there. It's interesting. So empathy is developed through some pretty key pathways, which are just really elegantly laid out. And it's so wonderful sometimes when science just works like that, and you're like, oh, well, there you go. It all fits into 4 nice little buckets. So there are 4 characteristics of an animal that can lead to your ability to empathize with that animal. Agency is how much does the animal take strides to serve their own needs. How do they feed themselves? How do they water themselves? How do they find mates? How do they play? Can you see all of that happening? Affectivity is how much of an animal's emotions can you perceive, right? In an animal like a dog, a lot of people say like, oh, my dog looks like he's smiling. Having a face increases your affectivity. In absence of those cues, we often confuse vitality or motion for affectivity. If an animal is sitting, animal is sad. If an animal is sleeping, an animal is sad. If an animal is moving around, an animal is happy. Super interesting. If you go to a zoo, listen to someone sometime, like a cat, which sleeps 20 hours a day, will just be lying there in the sun, and people will be like, oh, that's such a bummer. That cat looks so sad. You're like, what? Like, your cat like sleeps, my cat disappears for like at least 19 hours a day to who knows where, and I can only imagine she's sleeping. So, but that's just the way our brains work, is we think if we're moving, we're happy, if we're sitting, we're sad. That's a bummer. Coherence. How much does the animal actually look like an animal? So you may never have seen a pangolin in your entire life, but I show you a picture of a pangolin, and you're like, yeah, it's an animal. It has a face, it has arms, it has legs. Eyes are a big part of the continuity or the coherence puzzle. So if an animal has eyes, you're automatically like, it's an animal. Continuity is how much time you spend with the animal. Pets, empathy out the ears. Other animals, it decreases according to how much time you spend with them. So this is very interesting because you can think about an animal like, say, a sea otter at the place where I used to work, that has all these things in spades, right? You can watch the sea otter feeding, you can watch them playing, they've got really cute faces too, and people spend 20 minutes in front of that exhibit, especially if they're moving around. But then you think about an animal like a barnacle, and it strikes out on every count. No face, doesn't do anything. Who knows if it's even an animal or a rock, and I just stepped on it, so there's no chance to like watch it a little longer. So this becomes a really interesting challenge for us in zoos and aquariums, because yeah, sure, we're interested in empathy for big animals. We're probably more interested in empathy for the creepy crawlies and the slimies and the little ones. I was a herpetologist in undergrad, so I'm particularly interested in empathy for snakes and lizards and turtles. Turtles are easy. But a lot of what we do then is to bring these things out of those animals. So the example we like to give is about barnacles. There's one moment when people go from barnacle apathetic to what we'll say barnacle mildly interested. Any barnacle experts out there know what moment that is? No. Yeah.
When they start to feed.
Exactly. Yeah. when a barnacle feeds, it throws its feet up in the air and waves them around through the water, right? And all of a sudden, if you draw attention to that, they have agency, they're feeding themselves. They have affectivity, they're moving around, so we use that substitution. They have coherence, because now you can talk about how those are the legs, and actually they glue their heads to the ground, form the shell, kick their legs in the air. Kids can do a barnacle dance, it's very cute. And continuity, you spend more time watching, because you're like, whoa, I've never seen that before. And so that's how we start to create empathy for those animals that otherwise people would just pass by. Another part that's not included in this is individualization. It's really hard for us as human beings to feel empathy for like an entire population. People have tried, it's just really hard. You want to feel empathy for an individual. So that's another place where we've been working a lot to figure out how can we draw attention and individualize this cockroach. Right, like this cockroach is special. This cockroach has a unique life experience on this planet. And how do we tell you about that so that you care, or at least just have a little bit of inclination that this cockroach is something more than a pest? So those are the kinds of questions that we're wrestling with. There are a lot of barriers also to developing empathy. Some of the barriers include moral disengagement. So when we over-empathize with something, sometimes we can become morally disengaged from that critter, from that individual, whatever. The example I give here is polar bears. So when we were doing polar bear conservation around climate change, we were overloading people with these very depressing images of polar bears, the last minutes of its life, like struggling through the tundra and then dying in the, snow. And people didn't know what to do about that, right? And we're like, and then drive your car less. Like, that had nothing to do with, not nothing, but it's like 7 steps removed from the actual problem that we're trying to face. And so people became morally disengaged from polar bears, and that's almost become a trope now. Like, show a polar bear and like people's brains shut down. Like, they're not interested in what you have to say. It's very challenging for those of us working on polar bear conservation. Other barriers include cultural factors. So I tell a story often that my mom is Persian, and growing up in Iran, owls were a symbol, an omen of death. Right? If you saw an owl, there was death, harbinger of evil or whatever. You couldn't get her to like buy an owl shirt. Like anytime owls had that moment in their social sphere where they're like an icon, like she lost her mind. So getting her to care about owl conservation is a non-starter. Like there's just too many years of lore there for me to break through and say, I'm gonna get you, which is interesting living in Oregon, I'm gonna get you to care about great horned owls. So that's really important for us to recognize as well. There are others, the way we frame, we'll talk a little bit about this again, but the way we frame conversations about animals can make or break empathy immediately. And I'll give some examples about that. No, we're gonna stick. I took this slide out, but I'm putting it back in right now in my brain. So when we put all this back together, what we find is that there are 6 ways in which we can create empathy in our day-to-day practices. And this is our takeaway for you. I know a lot of you aren't developing educational programs for zoos or whatever, but these work in our everyday lives. They work when you're hiking. They work when I go out with my 4-year-old niece and we look a little more closely at an animal on the ground. The first one is framing. So we had, I love telling this story because every time I tell it, I'm like, what a bummer for this educator. We had an educator at the Point Defiance Zoo who was bringing a skink to a group of 5-year-olds. You know what a skink is? It's that lizard, it's like this big with a blue tongue. Yeah. So there was a girl in this class who was like, had been waiting her whole life, all 5 years of it, to meet this skink. And she was so excited. When the skink came in the classroom, she waved really frantically at the skink. And the educator very well-meaningly goes, it's okay, you don't have to wave, skinks don't understand waving. And the little girl goes, and her little shoulders drop. And she spends the rest of the class in the back with her arms crossed. Is it really important in that moment that people understand that skinks don't follow the human social convention of waving as a greeting? We're not asking you to like pick up its little arm and like wave it back. But we do this all the time as scientists, right? We get really wrapped up in what people know and how important it is for them to know things. And we have to step back and understand like what is more important right now, right? Is it detrimental for her to think that waving at the skink is something the skink will understand? She'll grow out of it, I promise. Like if she's that into skinks, she'll figure it out sooner or later. Or is it more important for her to maintain that connection with an animal that is already a little bit hard to connect to? So framing, super important. If you leave with nothing else, think about the way in which we frame stories about the environment, stories about animals and science. Think about how we may be hurting or helping empathy with that framing. The second one is modeling. So no matter how much time we spend with children especially, or anyone we're teaching, we're not going to be probably not going to be the most important people in their lives. Modeling is our way of understanding the full ecosystem of a person's social experience. So if you're teaching a class, to your students, you may be very important, but their parents are also very important. They're caregivers. So modeling proper behavior with animals can help demonstrate how we can interact with animals in an empathic fashion. Third one is experience. So I love this because people always say, like, excuse me, what about VR? What about AR? Like, can't we create animal experiences with VR and AR that are just as good, if not better, than going to a zoo? And the answer definitively is no. Science says no, because we are human beings that care about experiences. The more we can facilitate experiences for people with animals, live experiences with live animals, the more likely they are to feel empathy. There's just something about being able to go under and around and try to find a different vantage point. It's something about the feeling that is happening in this moment only. Like, you should watch kids when an animal poops in front of them. It's like the most profound experience they've ever, like, why? Because it's only happening in that moment, right? And they're so excited about it because it's doing something it didn't do 2 minutes ago and it's not gonna do 2 minutes from now, right? And so rich experiences are the cornerstone of empathy. Try to go through all 6 of them in my head. Imagination. So this used to be one that we're like, practice imagination with kids, but that's bunk. Imagination can be practiced with adults too. Adults can be fantastic imaginers. If we can even act out the experiences of animals, or the experiences that we used to do an activity called a cactivity, where I used to sit my graduate students in front of a cactus in the middle of the Baja Desert for 20 minutes. And I was like, I will see you in 20 minutes. I want you to sit there and think about that cactus. Watch that cactus. And the first 5 minutes are torture. And then after that, you start to imagine all of the things that this cactus goes through on a daily basis, the animals that interact with it, how an animal that eats it, how it gets water. What is that oozing happening right there? Like, why is that cactus so far away and it's the same kind? And that imagination, that ability to perspective take, even with something like a cactus, is really profound and helps us to be able to empathize, again, with that individual even more. That's 4. Knowledge building. So luckily, knowledge building is an empathy practice. So when people, so the thing we haven't talked about ad nauseum, which we usually talk about, is anthropomorphism. How many of you were thinking about anthropomorphism at some point in this? Yeah, a couple people. Right, absolutely. It's the elephant in the room. I thought I was so clever when I was like, what about anthropomorphism when I first heard all this? People, the takeaway for anthropomorphism is that people will anthropomorphize. People will fill in the gaps in their knowledge with their own experiences. And that's where anthropomorphism becomes detrimental. When you don't know about an animal's experience, you'll fill things in with your own experience. So the example we give is about our octopus. People will come up to the octopus at the Seattle Aquarium. It's not my octopus anymore. The octopus at the Seattle Aquarium, and it's by all means a palatial estate for a giant Pacific octopus. Like, they live in spaces this big. They can fit through anything this big. Right? And so they just spend all their time crammed up in the little corner of their den. And people come by and they're like, that octopus looks so sad and lonely. Because it's in a small space. And if I was in a small space, I'd be cramped. And if I were by myself, I'd be lonely. They don't know that octopods are solitary creatures that would kill another octopus if it came into their area. And they spend all their time in dark dens in the ocean until it's time to breed. So in absence of that knowledge, they fill it in with their own beliefs or own experiences, and that becomes detrimental anthropomorphizing, or what we like to call unenlightened anthropomorphization. So when we build knowledge, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to enlighten people a little bit as to the unique perspectives of an animal. You have to watch it, right? Because our favorite A word as scientists is actually. And so someone will tell us something, and if it's not 100% right, we'll go, actually, this other scientific thing that I know. And that's an empathy squasher right there, right? And so what's what we talk about a lot is how to build knowledge without squashing people's connections that they already hold to our ecosystems, to our places, to our animals, but allowing space for that while also allowing us to redirect some of that information to what might be more correct, right? So people would come to us at the aquarium and they'd say, oh, those otters are holding hands. They love each other. And our interpreters, our scientists, our keepers love to say, actually, that's what they do so they don't drift apart in the ocean, right? And then all of a sudden it's like, wow, this behavior I could really connect to because I'm holding hands with my kid, to, oh, it's just a behavior that means nothing, or it's just survivalist, right? And so what we have been trying to do instead is replace it with other A words, like also, and, right? Like, that might be true. Maybe you don't have to say that might be true. You can say they are a family group, so they have some kind of connection to each other. Did you also know that in the wild they would do this so that they don't drift apart? And so that's, we think about that a lot because with knowledge, we're so proud of ourselves for everything that we know. We forget that, again, it's not about what you know, it's about how you feel, and that can inform what you care about learning later on. Because they're not going to hear you after you say the actually, they don't care. The last one is my favorite one. It's practice. The more we can get people to practice caring about animals, the more empathic they'll become. So there's been research to demonstrate that people who have pets are more empathic people than those who don't have pets. We pretty much all say that, yeah, that makes sense. The more you care for something other than yourself, the more you have to practice seeing what another's needs are. The more you have to think about their perspective in the world and what they want, what they have to be happy and comfortable. And so the more we can get people to practice caring for the environment, the more we can get them to think about what the environment needs to thrive, what animals need to flourish. And that can be a really powerful tool for building empathy. So I'm going to close by returning to my original question. What inspired you to start out in this field, right? It probably wasn't a class you took in kindergarten or in high school or whatever. It probably wasn't a bunch of facts that you learned by reading a book. It was probably, that might have helped, or that might have contributed, but it was probably something that you felt along the way. It was probably an experience that you had that made you think about things in a new light, that made you understand the perspective of someone else in a way that you hadn't understood it before. We love this empathy project because we think it really is at the root of a lot of how we feel about the environment. I think a lot of people who are in this field resonate with this work because they can remember a time in their lives when they empathized with something other than themselves, and it set them down this path. We close this talk often in zoos and aquariums by saying that we are really good at talking about what we know and less good at talking about how we feel. And I think that is not just true for the informal science world, I think it's true for the science world in general. And it could be, my dad is a scientist, he's the truest scientist in the world. He got into this to study climate, he's not telling you what to do, he's just telling you about science. But that's not helping, right? He'll be the first person to say that the climate messaging, the climate research has not worked. And why? Because we haven't been appealing to people in terms of who they are and what they feel. We've been appealing to them on what they know. One of the key, the three main tenets of environmental education are know your audience, and know your audience. We use empathy to increase our relevancy in this field. By allowing ourselves to care about animals, it humanizes science, right? It lets people understand that we are not robots, we're human beings that care about the systems in which we work. If you think about all the kind of meme-y, trendy things that have come out around science, it's things like graduate students dancing out their dissertation, or a funny video that they made in lab. It's things that demonstrate that we are humans that feel as well. And I think that's what empathy is all about. Rich experiences, as I mentioned, and including people, right? Empathy, we could have a whole other talk on inclusion, but empathy needs to be inclusive of a variety of different perspectives and standpoints, right? Because, here's a fun fact. Feeling empathy for people and feeling empathy for animals happens in the exact same channels of your brain, right? It all fires in the same places. So if you can learn to feel empathy for animals, you can learn to feel empathy for people. And then we can get to more inclusive spheres where we are including more people in the conversations that we have about science and the environment. Okay, I think that's all I have. That's it. Thank you.
We've got plenty of time for questions.
Yeah.
So I was wondering about conservation, or if you've done any research or come across anything about not just animals, but empathy in animals, but empathy for places.
Yeah.
For
So-
habitats or for ecosystems. Yeah.
That comes up a lot. The best thing that I can guide you towards is the Nature is Speaking campaign by Conservation International. So that is a pretty awesome PR campaign where they had celebrities voice the ocean or the rainforest and talk like the ecosystem and how the ecosystem is experiencing the world. There is not a lot of evidence to suggest that landscape-based empathy works. We also may not be approaching it correctly right at this moment. And so that's an area of further investigation. In case anyone's going to talk about plants, it's the same way. We're not 100% sure how empathy for plants plays into this. I feel like it's going to be similar to empathy for barnacles, right? The kind of looking at a plant in a way that highlights those 4 areas. But with landscapes, the issue is scale. It's really challenging for people to understand just the way our brains are wired, the scales at which many of those landscapes operate. Not impossible, but I'm curious to see how we can develop that out. Yeah. But Nature is Speaking is a really cool way of conceptualizing that and seeing like, oh, that might be what it looks like. I'm gonna think about that more.
So I know you're still fairly new to the zoo position, but do you think that zoos versus aquariums face different challenges for inspiring empathy
Definitely.
or interacting with the audience?
I see you're wearing a Brevard Zoo hat. Is that Brevard? I saw the logo.
I've worked with that.
Super cool. One of my good friends is their director of conservation. Yeah, so yes, I think we do face similar challenges. The thing I love about the zoo and aquarium field is that we are the most collaborative field I've ever worked in. Like, if one person's problem is everyone's problem. That's kind of how our whole organization, the 228 accredited institutions, approach conservation. So yes, I think I think aquariums have a very big challenge in that very few people have experiences with the ocean, right? I think 3% of US citizens have ever scuba dived and only 12% have ever snorkeled. Like, that sucks when we're thinking about getting to know the ocean. There's huge swaths of this country that have never been in an ocean before. So we're trying to motivate people to care about ocean and building empathy for ocean animals. You're starting at a very different place, right? People have seen a squirrel. People have seen a bird before, right? Like, they've seen insects. And so you can kind of, the continuity piece, you can kind of keep the clock going on some of those critters. But yeah, I mean, that's what we have a great amount of respect for our aquarium colleagues in the middle of the country, because they really are the only place where people are going to see those animals for a lot of those communities. I think aquariums do a really good job of presenting the ocean, right, as a holistic, the one world ocean, as a holistic, not ecosystem, that's the wrong word, but as a unit. At the zoo, it's challenging for us because we're like the rainforest, and then the tundra, and then the temperate forest, and then the savanna. And that disconnect can get very jarring for people. And so we haven't quite figured out what the best way is to organize that learning, right? Is it to try and build empathy for all of the animals on the savanna? Or is it try to organize all the cats together so you're thinking as a cat as you go through all of these areas, or you're thinking as a primate or whatever? I don't know yet. Yeah. Yeah.
So I have a question. Well, first of all, this is really interesting.
Good.
And it's helped me to think in a few sort of slightly different ways.
Great.
Right? But now I've got this maybe dissonance in my way of thinking with what does a conservation community do with animals that they've decided they don't want there anymore? All right, so we have groups of invasive species that in a conservation biology sense are enemy number, put a number on it. And we put a target on their back. And we're trying to destroy our empathy for those organisms.
Yep. So, really glad you brought that up. A similar question comes up a lot when we talk about empathy for predators versus empathy for prey.
I was going to ask that one too, but this one I thought is...
It's the same mechanisms, right? So remember that empathy can happen unchecked, but part of the reason we're doing this project is to think about how we can intentionally develop empathy in people towards animals. So you have to choose who you're messaging the empathy towards, right? Are you messaging the empathy towards the animals that you want to X out? Are you messaging the empathy towards the animals that'll benefit? from the lack of that animal in the ecosystem. So the example I give is we used to do an activity at the Oregon Zoo where we used to feed live goldfish to our otters. And it was amazing. The kids would put the little goldfish in a Gatorade bottle, and we throw the Gatorade bottle into the otter exhibit, and the otter would shake the Gatorade bottles around, fish would go flying, and then they'd go catch them, and it was like the most exciting moment until we realized that like we have to be very careful about how we do this activity because a lot of kids have goldfish as pets. Right, and so we had to change the entire framing of the, we don't do it anymore because live animals, but we had to change the entire framing of the activity when we had a kid who was pretty disturbed by the fact that these fish were dying. We realized this was pre-empathy, but it still applies. We hadn't been framing the activity in terms of what was the otter's benefit here, right? That the otter is a predator that chases down their prey, and we do what we can, right? We have toys for him, we feed them at different times, but the opportunity to catch prey only happens when the kids do this one activity. So what we did instead is we peeled way back and like dehumanized, but de-animalized the goldfish a lot. I told the kids, what's your favorite food in the whole world? Pizza, hamburgers. Otters can't eat that. Otters, their favorite food in the whole world right now is goldfish. So when you put your goldfish in the Gatorade bottle, I want you to name that goldfish after your favorite food. So it's like and so it's really interesting because kids were like, here you go, like hamburger, thanks hot dog, bye pizza. And then they just got this overwhelming feeling like I'm sharing they get what it means to eat your favorite food, right? Like that hadn't clicked for them before. Like the feeling I get when I eat pizza is the feeling the otter might be having right now. So it's just, it was an interesting difference in framing. We cannot in our brains hold empathy for all animals at all times. That is too hard, right? Like that will lead to a lot of sadness. And so when we're thinking about how to message for empathy, how to inform and drive and foster empathy, we need to be intentional about who that empathy is directed towards. Does that make sense?
Well, I thought you did a really nice job of answering it. It's kind of problematic.
It can be, yeah. The culling of animals, that's a big issue in our field, right? When we think about culling populations, it gives you a gross, icky, weird feeling. There's opportunity, trophy hunting. Don't stand in a room with conservationists talking about trophy hunting because it will get bloody and ugly. But a lot of that is like the same kinds of tensions of what are we trying to accomplish? What's the greater goal? Does the end justify the means? All that kind of stuff. Well, my big takeaway with the empathy when you're wrestling with that is why are you doing this in the first place, right? Like why are we extirpating an invasive species? It's probably for the benefit of another species that wouldn't be able to live if this invasive species goes unchecked. So let's turn people's empathy towards that animal that we're trying to save, or that plant or whatever, and help them understand why that animal why their experience is the way that it is.
So a goldfish, you could pretty easily sort of take away our feelings for it.
Yeah.
But what if it was something cuddly that you were using as the prey?
We do a lot of carcass beatings.
No, if it was alive.
Yeah. No, it is challenging.
This is their natural prey, right?
Absolutely.
You have a very good day for the lion.
Yeah, I think it's funny. People have when you watch nature documentaries, Disney, all that are empathy masters, right? Like they are creating empathy, and before they show you a cute deer getting killed by a tiger, they have spent a lot of time introducing you to that tiger, getting you to care a lot about that tiger and her cubs, and how they've been starving for ages, and oh my goodness, food, right? And before they get to oh my goodness, food, you are invested in that tiger's survival, and you have understood at this point that tiger, if that tiger doesn't eat soon, it's going to die, right? And so next time you watch one of those nature documentaries, pay attention to what happens before you get to the moment where they kill this really sweet deer that is bounding really cutely Bambi style through the woods. Because they're building you up for that moment so you don't rebel. The moment it happens, you don't just shut off the TV and turn it, shut down. Yeah, Catherine.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating.
Yeah.
I had a question about, you did a great job describing how zoos can play a role in building empathy. How prescriptive are zoos, or what is sort of the discussion around how prescriptive zoos should be in getting people next step choices for political action?
We're getting way more deep into that. Yeah, so zoos used to be like, whatever, it's chill, whatever you want to do, we're just here to show you the animals. Like, not all zoos, but a lot of zoos rested on those laurels. And now we're getting angry, right? And we're noticing that we have more people go to zoos and aquariums in the US every year than go to all professional sporting events combined.
Yeah.
All of them, right? Like,
Really?
yes, really. Yeah. And that population is diverse across socioeconomic status, across gender spectrums, across political affiliations. It's more diverse than art museums for sure, science centers, all of those places where people have this concept that it's only for a certain type of person. The only thing we suffer from is people thinking that zoos are only for children. We're trying to break through that, right? People say like, well, I haven't gone to the zoo in a while. And you're like, oh, why? And they're like, well, I don't have a kid anymore. You're like, okay. Well, animals aren't just for children, but okay. And all of our signage is actually for adults. But, but cool. Let me know if you change your mind. And so we're becoming way more, like the aquarium right before I left hired a person whose entire job is to do policy work and advocacy. And so she goes to Olympia every week to figure out what's coming up next, what our position should be, how we should market that, and the education team works together to figure out. We did a project on the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Act where we did a postcard writing campaign with our visitors to just send our legislators 400 postcards saying, just keep it how it is. We like it how it is, don't change it, right? At the zoo, we just had this conversation yesterday, like where is our political power and how can we be leveraging that, especially with things like condors, right? And other animals where legislation may be necessary. Straw bans, plastic bag bans, these are all things that are no-brainers for us. We should absolutely be involved, and we are. We have a government affairs specialist over at our national headquarters for the whole association. So, in case you don't know, there are 2,400 animal holding facilities in the US. Only 228 of those are accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. So people often come to me and they're like, I don't like zoos. I went to this roadside zoo in North Carolina. I was like, stop. That's not a zoo. That is someone's weird private collection, right? There are less egregious examples of that, right, of course, but our governing body, the AZA, has a whole government affairs arm. And every year they have a Capitol Hill week where they go and anyone from any zoo can come and they will lead you on an advocacy tour on the Hill to, petition for anti-wildlife trafficking or plastic bans or whatever, or just general Endangered Species Act upholding. And it's pretty cool. So I think we're seeing ourselves grow. Not every zoo is going to be able to do that just because of the way we're funded by government, or we're funded by private, or we're funded by donations, whatever. But I think the ones who can are starting to take the charge on that. Yeah. Other questions? About anything? Zoos, empathy, animals? Yeah.
So, also just wanted to echo really fun and engaging talk, so thank you. And it got me thinking about, you had the one slide about the current era of sort of the assault on truth, let's just call it that. How are zoos and aquariums handling that? Like I know it's a little bit different of an arena for all sorts of like agencies versus universities versus.
It is, but we're undergoing our own assault as well. So public perception of zoos and aquariums has dropped to an all-time low, which is devastating. I mean, like, it just sucks because we're working so hard to save animals and putting so much money towards field conservation and out there helping people in Borneo train elephants so that they don't cross over, whatever. And because of things like blackfish, we are facing an assault on our relevancy, right? And so we've had to think a lot about that in terms of this, like what has become fashionable, right? It's become part of your wokedness to say like, oh, like I believe in this, this, and this, and zoos are bad, right? And so that's kind of, the people who come to us generally believe in science. Like that is, we have tested our audiences in Seattle at least and across the country. They're generally science believers or science open. They're open to us telling them about science, which is really interesting because they aren't open to everyone telling them about science. But people trust, especially aquariums, People trust aquariums as a source of information about climate change over many, many, many other places. That's great. But if they don't come to us in the first place because they perceive us as being bad places for animals, it doesn't matter if they trust us as a climate change conduit, like for information, because it's going to be about the condition of the animals first. So that's those roads are continuing in parallel tracks, and we're trying to figure out as a community, where have we gone wrong in telling our story, right? Where have we dropped the ball on telling people? Because the most ironic part is the people who believe in zoos the least are millennial females. Like, God damn it. Like, I personally really feel that one. Like, where have I gone wrong personally with my social circle, where in my own cohort doesn't believe in the work that I do, right? And so we're trying to figure out how have we told our story wrong. And I think it's the same story the same thing a lot of scientists are doing, where they're like, where have we gone wrong in telling our story so that people don't trust us anymore? People don't believe what we're saying. And so we're I think both sides are paying attention to the other now to see, like, how are we being transparent about science? How are we being transparent about animal care? Shows like the zoo have done a really good job of that, where animals die. They do. It's a bummer, but they die all over the place, right? And we'll show it on television. You can see a vet crying because they weren't able to do the thing that would have fixed the whatever. And so this tension between not believing in science and not believing in zoos is so challenging and so problematic that I think we are working together to try to rebrand both sides, right? Rebrand science, rebrand conservation, and make them things that people see as being valuable instead of as being disposable or questionable. Yeah. I could go on about that forever. Yeah.
So I understand the idea of like fostering positive experiences with animals to make people be empathetic. Do you have like a plan of attack when something inevitably like animal traumatic happens and a child and or adult is like, oh my god, like he ate him and now I hate that animal forever, and just sort of like, I think
it's like you just fed me that question, because that was the next thing I was going to say when I was like, I could talk about this forever. Remember an animal named Harambe? Right, so that like even just gives me chills to think about. Because Miami University runs with the Cincinnati Zoo, so like that zoo is a second home to me in a lot of ways. The director is one of my best friend's dads. Like, it's just a really near and dear place to my heart. And what happened with Harambe was horrible, right? I'm not even going to tell you what it was because you all know it was such a pop culture moment. And it got worse, right? People made memes of this shit. Like, oh no, I'm being taped. Of this stuff. And like when I was rowing on the Mont Lake Cut, there was like Harambe died for our sins written in the cut. And I was like, really? Like, do you even know who Harambe was? He was an important animal to a lot of people. Like, a lot of people lost a lot of joy and sleep and days of their lives because of that decision. And so how did the Cincinnati Zoo come back from that, right? Like, how did they avoid just a complete mutiny? Remember Fiona? Yeah. So Fiona happened right after Harambe. Yeah. And Fiona is the ultimate story of positive empathy. And so it wasn't about changing the narrative on gorillas, right? I think people had a lot of feelings about gorillas, but generally their negative feelings were not towards gorillas, they were towards the zoo for that decision. So what do we need to do then is use empathy to create positive feelings for the good work that happens, right? Like, Fiona would have died had it not been for round the clock, 27 hours a day care. That now she's a flourishing, happy little bouncing baby hippo. So when we think about where that fear of these animals comes from, it's important to think about what is underlying it really, right? And for Harambe and Fiona, what was underlying it was care. People were pissed that that a gorilla died, right? They understand gorillas are scary. They probably understood that kid was in real danger, but they were angry and felt a lot of negative empathy for the death of that animal, because they asked, like, couldn't we have done anything to save that animal? And so the response to that was, we do things to save animals all the time. Here's another example. Yeah.
So I know, for example, like at the Brevard Zoo earlier this year, they have a rhino encounter where so, kids or people can go up and interact.
Yeah.
But one of the kids got injured and had to go to the hospital, right? So just how do you personally feel like you should balance those experiences where you do get closer or get to experience or interact with the animals while still, I mean, it's a fine line, right?
Totally. I mean, I am all for experiences, safe, comfortable experiences with animals. I can remember every single time I've ever fed a rhino, and it's amazing. I got to meet red pandas twice this year, and it was like transformative cute aggression. Just completely lost all of my marbles. Those experiences matter a lot. Are things gonna happen? Sometimes, right? It's all in how you deal with it, I think, after, right? So recognizing that things happen, recognizing that, I mean, if something happens where someone is mauled or something, we have a lot of questions, but small, like a rhino can turn their head, and if your finger is right there, you'll get smashed, right? And I won't break anything, but you could bleed, right? And so how do we talk about that in terms of what was the rhino doing in that moment, right? Rhino wasn't acting out of fear. The rhino was probably saying like, when there's food over here, and there's food over here, and so recognizing that animals aren't, not necessarily, but a lot of these animals aren't inherently dangerous. We're not doing encounters with animals that are inherently dangerous, but every single animal in the world is a wild animal, even your dog, even your cat. And so how do we reframe those negative experiences with animals as being not malicious, but part of living in a world where we have critters? Yeah.
Just to kind of continue that conversation, how do you inspire empathy, but also respect for these animals and the fact that they are wild animals, and just because you can connect with it doesn't mean that you can ride it.
Yeah, we get that a lot because people will come and be like, oh, I want that animal to be my pet. And what I say about that is that's pretty misinformed empathy, right? That's that unenlightened anthropomorphism. Remember, empathy does not mean loving an animal. Those two often get conflated, that you have to love something to feel empathy for it. You can be afraid of something and still empathize. You can dislike something and still empathize. I play this game a lot where I'm like, I was just in Brazil for a long time and I got bit a lot by some ant or mosquito, and I don't love that animal, but I can understand their experience in the world and how it was necessary, or they decided that I was a necessary feeding ground for them, right? These are the exercises that you can go through in your head. But I think people conflate those two and then say you can only, I have to, having respect for the animal and empathizing for it have to be one and the same. But in fact, they're building blocks on each other. So I think that's important to remember what empathy is and isn't. It is part of what we're looking at in a whole different project we didn't talk about, which is on measuring empathy and what are the indicators of empathy actually happening in real life. Yeah.
Do you think there's any possibility that empathy is causing negative effects in the conservation world?
Yes. I think over-empathizing or misdirected empathy can hurt our causes because of things like, I'm not going to bring up the Harambe example again, but things like that where people direct all of their empathy in a way that's not productive or towards an animal that we don't want them to empathize with at the detriment of being informed or feeling empathy for animals or ecosystems we do want them to be directed to. I think this is, the clearest example I can think of is blackfish for us, right? That was an empathy machine. It was created so that people would feel empathy for orcas in a very specific way, a way that keepers and trainers later sued them for being, a misinterpretation. But it was extremely detrimental to the work that we're doing, right? Working at an aquarium, people always ask us, do you have orcas here? Like it was a test. And we're like, no, we don't keep cetaceans. They're like, okay, good. You passed. Okay, that's not fair. We don't, but we still support our colleagues who do, right? I'm not against the Shed Aquarium for having belugas. Different institutions have different priorities. They have different animals, different areas of expertise. And for us, that was a very pivotal moment in thinking about how no one cared about orcas until SeaWorld, right? I had never seen an orca before SeaWorld. I wagered a bet, and there was a New York Times or something article that came out about this, that SeaWorld was what made us care about orcas, and their mistake was thinking that that's all there was. right? They didn't realize the empathy machine that they had created, and people cared for. People called them killer whales because they wanted to, you know, like demonize them in this way, and they went from that to a much loved symbol, and somehow SeaWorld didn't come along with them, right? Like they didn't follow that train, and that was to their eventual detriment, sadly. Does that answer your question? So recognizing, yeah, it's a problem. I don't have an answer for it yet, but it is a problem. And again, intentionality, right? Like being aware of what we're doing. Now with our elephants, we're very aware of how we are talking about our elephants, very aware of how we are discussing the high levels of care that they get, because elephants are another example of an animal where people feel a lot of feelings about them being in zoos. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, a good sign of a good talk is an endless stream of questions. We've gone way over the normal allotted times. We'll give you a little bit of a break, and we have some refreshments in the back and about half an hour of time to hang out and chat a little bit more with Kathayoon. So let's